When I first met Azari, I thought I had found my soulmate. From the moment we locked eyes, something clicked between us. She had this warmth about her, a smile that made everything seem brighter. We connected instantly and everything seemed perfect. I loved her more than anything, and I thought she felt the same way. In those early days, it felt like we could conquer the world together. Every moment was exciting, every conversation meaningful, and we shared so much. It was everything I had ever wanted. But as time passed, things started to change. Slowly at first, almost like I didn't notice it happening. There were no major arguments, no obvious red flags, just this creeping sense that something wasn't quite right. It began with little things. She became more distant, less affectionate. At first, I chalked it up to work stress, the pressures of everyday life. I tried not to overthink it. Maybe she was just tired, or maybe we were both just busy with our own lives. But the longer it went on, the more I felt the space between us grow. I tried to talk to her about it, but she always brushed me off. "I'm just tired," she'd say. "It's been a long week. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, I see how those little dismissals added up." I started wondering if something was wrong with me, if I was doing something to push her away. She never seemed to want to talk about what was going on inside her head, and I couldn't help but feel helpless. It wasn't just emotionally that I started to notice the distance, it was physically too. We were still together, still living in the same house, but there was a growing void between us. In the beginning, we had this intense physical connection. We were affectionate, always holding hands, kissing, touching. But soon, those small moments of intimacy faded. When I reached for her hand, she would pull away. When I tried to kiss her, she'd turn her head or say she wasn't in the mood. I thought maybe she was just having a rough time. I tried to be understanding, tried to give her the space she needed. But the more I tried, the more distant she became. The worst part was that it felt like no matter what I did, it wasn't enough. I'd plan romantic dinners. I'd surprise her with flowers. I'd make time for us to reconnect. I thought maybe if I did all the right things, things would get better. But they didn't. Instead of coming closer, it felt like we were drifting further apart. It was like I was doing everything I could, but it was still never enough for her. The sexual intimacy became almost non-existent, and when it did happen, it felt hollow, like she was just going through the motions. I couldn't understand what had happened to the woman I had fallen in love with. Where had the spark gone? Why did she seem so disinterested? I kept asking myself these questions, but I never got any answers. At first, I tried to talk to her about it, but every time I did, she'd shut me down. "I'm fine," she'd say, "don't worry about it," but I couldn't stop worrying. I could feel the distance between us growing every day, and I didn't know how to stop it. She was my partner, my best friend, and yet she was slipping away, and I felt powerless to do anything about it. It wasn't just about the lack of sex, it was about everything. The closeness, the connection, the love. All of it seemed to be fading, and I couldn't figure out why. I started to blame myself. Was I not enough? Was I doing something wrong? Maybe she had outgrown me. Maybe I had somehow failed her. These thoughts consumed me. I kept trying to hold on to what we had, but the harder I tried, the more it felt like I was losing her. I kept wondering if this was just a phase, if things would go back to the way they were. But deep down, I knew something had shifted between us, and I wasn't sure I could fix it. The distance between Azari and me kept growing, and I didn't know how to fix it. I had tried everything I could think of to bring us back to where we once were, but nothing seemed to work. It wasn't just the physical distance, though, that was a big part of it. It was the emotional distance that hurt the most. I felt like I was living with a stranger, someone I used to know intimately, but now felt like I couldn't reach. It was like she had built this wall around herself, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't break through. I would come home from work, looking forward to spending time with her, but instead of the warm welcome I used to get, it was like she was just going through the motions. Her smile no longer lit up the room when she saw me, and the spark that had once been there seemed completely gone. We'd sit together, but the silence felt heavier than before. When I tried to ask her about her day, she'd give short, almost uninterested answers. I knew something was wrong, but she never opened up to me. It felt like I was chasing her, but no matter what I did, I couldn't catch up. I started to pull away myself, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't force her to talk to me, and I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when it so clearly wasn't. The loneliness in our relationship became unbearable, and I found myself questioning whether this was what I had signed up for. Was this how relationships were supposed to feel? Were we supposed to feel so disconnected? I tried not to show how hurt I was, but I couldn't hide the sadness that had started to take root inside me. The person who used to be my closest companion now felt like a distant acquaintance. I kept telling myself that it was just a phase, that things would get better, but deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. Azari would become more distant the more I tried to engage with her. She stopped making an effort to do the little things we used to do together, the things that used to make us happy. The dinners we used to cook together, the movies we used to watch on lazy nights, those things had stopped. Even when we were in the same room, she seemed miles away. She would often be on her phone, scrolling through messages or lost in her own thoughts, and it hurt to see her so disengaged. The more this went on, the more I felt like I was fighting a battle I couldn't win. I wanted to talk to her about it, but I didn't want to push her further away. I was already walking on eggshells, afraid that any wrong move would send her retreating even more. The pressure to make things work began to feel suffocating. I was losing myself in trying to fix something that felt broken, but I didn't know how to stop trying. I started to notice the signs that there might be more going on than just a temporary rough patch. She'd go out more often, spending longer hours away from home, saying she was meeting friends or handling errands. I didn't mind her having some space. I understood that we both needed time for ourselves. But it started to feel like she was always gone, always out of the house, leaving me to wonder what was happening when she wasn't with me. It wasn't just the time apart that bothered me, it was the way she acted when she was home. It was as if she was never really there, even when she was physically present. I started to second-guess everything. Was she seeing someone else? Was I being paranoid, or was there something I wasn't seeing? I didn't want to believe it, but the way she withdrew from me made it hard to ignore the possibility. I began to feel like I was losing her in a way I couldn't explain, and the fear of what might be happening made me more desperate to hold on. But the harder I tried to hold on, the more it felt like she was slipping through my fingers. And I didn't know how to stop it. I never imagined that I would find out the truth this way. The night I discovered the messages on Azari's phone still feels like a nightmare replaying in my head. I wasn't the kind of guy to snoop through her things, but that night I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I had seen her phone on the kitchen counter, buzzing with notifications as usual. Normally I wouldn't have paid much attention, but this time, something compelled me to look. Maybe it was the endless doubts swirling in my mind, or maybe it was the quiet desperation I had been feeling for weeks. I knew it was a bad idea as soon as I picked up her phone, but I couldn't stop myself. I was afraid that if I didn't check, I'd keep spiraling into uncertainty. I opened the messages thinking it was just another conversation with a friend or a work colleague. What I found, however, left me breathless. There in front of me were texts between Azari and someone named Jackson. The way they spoke to each other wasn't just friendly, it was intimate, flirtatious, and undeniably personal. As I scrolled through the conversation, it became clear that this wasn't just a harmless exchange. She had been seeing him for weeks, maybe longer, and the things they talked about were the things I had once shared with her, things I thought were ours alone. I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding in my chest as I read through each message. There were details, small moments that were supposed to be intimate between us, now shared with someone else. She talked about things she hadn't shared with me in months, the kind of affection and care I'd been longing for but never received. It was hard to believe, harder to accept. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. I felt like the ground beneath me had shifted, like everything I thought I knew about our relationship had been turned upside down. I didn't want to believe it. I kept telling myself I was misinterpreting what I was reading. Maybe this was all just some innocent flirtation. But the more I read, the more I realized that wasn't the case. Azari had been emotionally and physically involved with someone else, and what made it worse was that she had never been honest with me. She never told me she was unhappy, never mentioned that she needed something more, or that there were things missing from our relationship. Instead, she had found a way to hide it all from me. She had been lying to my face while she shared her most intimate thoughts and desires with him. The realization hit me like a punch in the gut. I felt sick to my stomach, humiliated, and completely betrayed. How could she do this to me? I had loved her with everything I had. I had been there for her, tried to make things work. And all along, she had been sneaking behind my back. I felt foolish for not seeing the signs earlier. There had been so many moments where I felt her pulling away, but I ignored them, hoping it was just a phase. But this was something entirely different. It wasn't just a rough patch, it was a complete break in the foundation of our relationship. The anger inside me was overwhelming, but so was the sadness. I couldn't wrap my mind around how things had gotten so bad. All I could think about was how much I had tried to be a good partner, how much I had given to this relationship, and yet it still wasn't enough. I wasn't even sure who to be angry at her for betraying me or myself for not seeing the warning signs sooner. I sat there holding her phone in my hands, knowing that I couldn't just ignore what I had seen. The truth was right in front of me, and there was no denying it. It felt like my entire world had come crashing down in that one moment. The woman I loved had found someone else to give her the things I couldn't: emotional intimacy, affection, and everything she needed that I couldn't provide. When I confronted her, the guilt in her eyes was overwhelming, but it wasn't enough to erase the pain. I had never imagined this moment would come. I always thought that if things ever went wrong, if there was a problem, we would talk it out and work through it together. But this felt different. This wasn't something we could fix with a conversation. The trust between us had been shattered, and no amount of words could undo the damage. I remember the look on her face when I first brought it up. I had kept quiet for days after I found the messages. My mind had been spinning with anger, disbelief, and confusion. I didn't want to just accuse her without hearing it from her first. I needed to know if she would confess, or if I would have to confront her with the truth I had already seen. The night I finally gathered the courage to confront her, I felt like I was walking into a storm. Azari's face went pale when I showed her the messages. She tried to deny it at first, but there was nothing she could say that would explain away the texts. I had the proof clear and undeniable. She didn't even try to defend herself when I pointed it out. Instead, she just broke down, tears streaming down her face as she admitted to everything. The guilt was evident, but it didn't make the pain of her betrayal any less intense. She told me how unhappy she had been for a while, how she had been feeling neglected in our relationship. She said that she had tried to communicate it to me, but I had been so wrapped up in my own world that I didn't see it. At that moment, all I could feel was a cold emptiness inside me. I had tried so hard to be there for her. I had made every effort to keep our relationship strong, to keep the spark alive. But somehow, that wasn't enough. She had felt neglected, unloved, unappreciated, and instead of coming to me and talking it through, she had turned to someone else. She had found comfort in another man's arms while I had been oblivious, trying to hold on to something that was slipping through my fingers. Azari told me that it wasn't just the lack of sex that drove her to cheat, but the emotional distance that had grown between us. She said she hadn't felt desired or truly loved for months, and that no matter what I did, I never seemed to fulfill the emotional needs she had. It felt like a slap in the face. I had tried, I really had. I thought I was doing the right things, but apparently it wasn't enough. And the worst part was that I hadn't even known. I didn't realize how deep her dissatisfaction ran. As she talked, the anger inside me grew. But at the same time, I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness. This wasn't what I wanted for us. I didn't want to lose her, but how could I trust her again after everything that had happened? How could I ever look at her the same way? She had betrayed me in the worst way possible. And even though she was sorry, even though she was crying and asking for forgiveness, I didn't know how to move forward from this. Her apology wasn't enough. It couldn't take back what she had done. It couldn't erase the hurt, the sense of betrayal that had taken root in my heart. As she continued to apologize, all I could think was, why didn't you come to me before it got this far? Why didn't she talk to me? Why didn't she trust me enough to let me in? I wanted to be angry, to scream at her, but instead I felt numb. The reality of what had happened weighed heavily on me, and I realized that no matter how much she begged for forgiveness, nothing would ever be the same again. I didn't know what to do. I loved her, but in that moment, I didn't know if I could ever truly forgive her. The idea of her being with someone else, of sharing herself with someone who wasn't me, was too much to bear. I wanted to make it work, but the trust we had was broken beyond repair. We could never go back to what we had. The foundation of our relationship had crumbled, and I wasn't sure if we could ever rebuild it. The silence between us was suffocating as I tried to process everything. She begged me to stay, promised that she would do anything to fix things, but I was left with more questions than answers. Could I ever trust her again? Could we truly move past this? My heart was torn, and I knew that no matter what I decided, things would never be the same. In the days that followed, everything felt like a blur. The conversations we had were difficult, filled with moments of silence and awkwardness. Azari kept apologizing, telling me how sorry she was, how she regretted everything, but no matter how many times she said it, the words felt hollow. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to forgive her, to find a way to make things work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been irreparably broken. The trust that we had built over the years was shattered, and every time I looked at her, I saw the betrayal staring back at me. There were times when I wanted to scream at her, to tell her how much she had hurt me, but the anger didn't come. Instead, I felt a deep sadness that I couldn't escape. She had been the love of my life, and now she wasn't the woman I had fallen in love with anymore. It was hard to look at her and not feel betrayed by every smile, every touch, every moment we had shared. She had let someone else into our relationship in a way I could never forget. No apology, no matter how sincere, could erase the pain that lingered in the space between us. I tried to find solace in the idea of moving on. Maybe it was time to let go, to walk away from something that had been broken beyond repair. But the idea of ending it all was overwhelming. We had been together for so long, shared so much, and despite everything, I still loved her. I couldn't imagine my life without her, but at the same time, I couldn't see a way forward where I wouldn't always question her loyalty. I kept wondering if this was just one mistake in a long series of missteps, or if this was who she really was now. Could I ever feel the same way about her? Could I ever trust her again? Azari begged me to stay, to try and rebuild what we had, but I didn't know if that was even possible. Every attempt to rebuild felt like walking on eggshells. I couldn't stop thinking about her betrayal, about how she had chosen someone else when she should have come to me. The emotional distance that had started all of this now felt permanent, like a chasm that was too wide to bridge. I had tried for so long to be everything she needed, and yet it still wasn't enough. I had poured my heart into this relationship, and it felt like she had taken that love for granted. She hadn't come to me when she was unhappy. She hadn't trusted me enough to open up before it was too late. Every night I lay awake, wondering what went wrong, wondering if there was something I had missed along the way. Could I have done more? Could I have been better? But the truth was, no amount of self-blame would change what had happened. Azari had made her choice, and that was something I couldn't undo. The hardest part was realizing that even if we could rebuild, it would never be the same. The trust was gone, and without it, what was left? Eventually, I realized that I needed to take a step back, to give myself time to heal. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, torn between love and betrayal. It wasn't fair to either of us. I needed space to process everything, to figure out if there was any way I could move forward with her, or if it was time to let go for good. The hardest part wasn't saying goodbye, but knowing that I had loved someone so deeply, only to have it all crumble apart because of a single choice she had made. I told her that I needed time to think, that I couldn't make a decision just yet. She cried, pleading with me to stay, but I knew that I needed to find my own peace, to stop letting the anger and sadness consume me. I didn't know what the future held, whether we would ever be able to repair what had been broken, or if I would eventually walk away for good. But for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was doing something for myself. I had to figure out what I wanted, not what she wanted, and that was the hardest thing of all.